Hello, thank you for having me here this morning. Today I will be discussing the ADA and how it relates to interpreters. ADA stands for Americans with Disabilities Act, shortened to ADA, and I will be discussing how interpreters relates to the ADA. You asked me to come here to talk about interpreters, so I will be discussing interpreters and specifically how it correlates with the ADA. First, I would like to give you a brief overview of what the ADA is before I go deep in depth about specific titles. There are 5 titles of the ADA, but interpreters really only relates to the first 3, so we won't go into depth about the last 2 of the titles. Title I relates to employment, and specifically the employment of private organizations. To be a private organization that has to abide by the ADA regulations, you must have 15 or more employees. This was a recent change. This past summer, it was lowered from 25 to 15 employees. Private organizations with more than 15 employees must abide by the ADA regulations. However, if you have less than 15 employees, you do not have to abide by the regulations. Title number 2 relates to public entities, which specifically relates to the state and local government. Title number 2 will discuss programs, benefits, everything that has to do with equal access. Title number 3 will discuss public accommodations. Public accommodations must be completed by any public workplace, such as the place that we are in today. Title number 4 discusses telecommunications. These communications are, for example, relay services for the deaf. These have to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These services will be turned off for Christmas break, though. You don't believe me? No, I'm just kidding. These services have to be available 365 days a year to ensure equal access to communication. Title number 5 is all of the miscellaneous laws that are still incredibly important and have to be included in the ADA regulations, but they don't fit into any of the 4 previous categories. The legislative branch, the post office, the Library of Congress, these all are included in the 5th title. However, Title 4 and Title 5 do not directly correlate with interpreters, so we will only be discussing the first 3 and will not go into any more depth of the 4th and 5th title. As a deaf presenter, I typically have problems with interpreters who aren't knowledgeable in the topic of ADA. These interpreters are wonderful and knowledgeable and skilled, but without the knowledge in the specific topic, there tends to be a barrier in communication. For example, the specific terminology that I use must be known by the interpreter, or I can be represented as presenting of a 5th grade level. For example, effective communication. When I fingerspell effective, you know it means successful. However, effective and accessible communication look very similar, and if the interpreter is not knowledgeable in the concepts of the ADA, it may be more difficult for a successful interpretation. Not only is it important for the interpreter to be skilled, but it's also important for them to be knowledgeable in the topic being discussed for a very successful interpretation. Now, going back to the 3 titles of the ADA. Title number 1, which relates with employment, is regulated by the EEOC, which stands for Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It's their responsibility to check up and make sure that all places of employment are providing accessibility to those of the ADA. In addition, if you have any complaints, this is where you would go. However, neither the EEOC or the ADA has specific guidelines of what the specific interpreters that should be provided. They don't say if they need to be certified, if they need to be college graduates. Any of these things aren't listed, so the interpreters provided may not be up to par. They use the phrase reasonable accommodation, but how do you know what reasonable accommodation is without these guidelines of what an interpreter must possess? An example of a place of employment that would provide reasonable accommodation is for someone in a wheelchair. If they entered the workplace and the desk was too low, they would higher it so that the wheelchair could easily fit under, or lower it if it was too high. This is an example or one form of reasonable accommodation. This is one example of one form of reasonable accommodation, or interpreters changing of jobs. All of these can be examples. The place of employment is responsible for providing these accommodations. Many factors go into providing an interpreter, not only the situation that you would use, for example, staff meetings, training, evaluations, all of these may need an interpreter, but it also depends on the deaf consumer. Do they ask for an interpreter? Do they need an interpreter? Some situations they may need an interpreter, in other situations they may be fine communicating by themselves. In some instances, businesses can claim to be under a hardship where they cannot provide accessibility to those under the ADA. These businesses must be completely failing down, not having the money, not having the resources available to them to provide these to provide the accessibility necessary. So this was all regarding title number 1, and now we're going to move on to title number 2 and 3 because they are regulated by the same group known as the Department of Justice. Title number 2 is public entities and public 3. Title number 2 is public entities and title number 3 is public accommodations. Both of these have public in their name. However, they are dealing with two separate types of publicity. Title 2 is referring to state and local governments, and Title 3 is referring to private companies. The Department of Justice does provide a description of what is expected of these interpreters. However, there's two different descriptions that we are going to discuss. At first, it says that you must be certified, but it doesn't state who needs to be certified and what kind of certificate or what level of certificate. These things are necessary in providing a successful interpreter. An occurrence happened to me recently when I was presenting in Iowa at a women's conference. I was looking for an interpreter that was certified, and they wanted a woman interpreter, and we searched everywhere, and could not find any in Iowa City. So what happened was a wonderful interpreter from Chicago flew in to interpret for my presentation.